good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this timely and relevant webinar on how can non-state actors strengthen climate action transparency. My name is Miriam Hinostroza, and I am the head of the Global Climate Action Unit at the Mitigation Branch in UNEP's Climate Change Division. I will be moderating this important webinar where selected experts with vast policy and research experience in climate change and transparency will share valuable insights, perspectives, findings, and recommendations from a recent UNEP report that focuses on improving the integration of actions by non-state actors with national processes under the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And probably you've heard this Enhanced Transparency Framework by now many times, as this is the crucial year for signatories to the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement. So currently, many countries are, as we speak, preparing their first ever biannual transparency report, which are due by December 31st of this year. And at the same time, countries are also preparing their 2025 cycle of their nationally determined contributions, which are expected to be submitted around February 2025. So in the Paris Agreement, parties were encouraged to make net zero commitments by 2050 or longer term. And since then, there has been widespread adoption of net zero commitments by non-state actors as well. And recognizing their significance, these commitments are seen as vital supplements to government efforts, as they also raise ambition, and we expect that they drive stakeholder engagement as well, and contribute to the collective pursuit of Paris Agreement's global goals. So while the ETF provides a guidance for reporting climate actions taken by government, there is currently no generally accepted guidance on how to integrate NSA efforts into the national transparency process. So the report commissioned by UNEP and developed by these high-level experts in the panel is timely and in the sense that it provides insights on how the national level reporting and transparency efforts that have evolved significantly over the last decades is providing learning opportunities for the NSA communities. So the panel for today's webinar is comprised by authors, contributors, and reviewers of the report. So first, we have my esteemed director, John Christensen. He has worked with the UN Environment Program in various capacities for over 30 years. Since 1990, he has served as the director of the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, including in the earlier settings in Riso and the Technical University of Denmark. So John has contributed also significantly to the IPCC, serving on its bureau as a lead author for multiple IPCC reports. Additionally, he has co-edited the UNEP Emissions Gap Report for the past 13 years. We also have Dr. Katia Semyonova, who has worked for more than 20 years with the UNFCCC Secretariat as an SBI coordinator and transparency manager. For her contribution as a lead author to the IPCC as well, she received a Nobel Prize diploma. Now she works as an independent researcher, and she's collaborating with UNEP and the center as well. We also have Dr. Angel Su. She's an associate professor of public policy and the environment at the UNC Chapel Hill. She's the founder and director of the data-driven EnviroLab. Her research explores the intersection of science and policy and the use of data-driven approaches to understand environmental sustainability, particularly for climate change and energy, urbanization, and air quality. She was a contributing author to the IPCC as well, the Sex Assessment Report, and lead author of the 2018 UNEP Emissions Gap Report chapter on non-state actor and subnational actors. She has a PhD in environmental policy from Yale University and was formerly an assistant professor of environment studies at Yale NSU College in Singapore. Finally, we have Ruta Gubien, is a team leader at the UN Climate Change Transparency Division with 20 years experience in international climate policy. She developed and implemented the UNFCCC measurement, reporting, and verification system for developed country parties. Currently, Ruta's work focuses on operationalizing the enhanced transparency framework for 195 countries under the Paris Agreement, so Ruta has tremendous responsibility on her shoulders. So without further ado, let me invite our panelists in the following order. So John will walk us through the scope of the study. Then Katia will follow, sharing with us lessons from the transparency experience under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Then John comes back and continue with findings of the report, offering a deep dive analysis of the diverse landscape of non-state pledges and reporting schemes, engagement and credibility. Then we will hear from Angel on a little deeper on inclusions of NSA in the current indices, showing the status and options for improvement. Last but not least, then Ruta will share with us the consultations for the recognition and accountability framework. And finally, John will close with interventions presenting the recommendations formulated in the report. I hope we will have some time allocation for questions and answers, and I hope that you also contribute at the end. So with that, I leave John to present us the scope of the report. John, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Miriam, for the introduction. And also thank you because in the end, financing and helping making the report happen. So I will very briefly, you already said some of it, so I'll try and make it brief about the scope of the report, because I mean, what was really driving us when we started talking about it a couple of years ago was that there is an increasing recognition of the importance of non-state actors for achieving the Paris goals. And at the same time, there's really no generally accepted guidance on how to harmonize or how to integrate the efforts into the National Transparency Project process and also into the NDCs, as we'll talk about later. So basically, we put up 3 sort of key questions that we're trying to answer in the report. And we're going to talk to those questions here with the 3 other speakers. The first one is basically looking at what is the experience we've had over the last 2 decades or more with transparency efforts for countries, for the parties to the convention, and what kind of learning does that provide for engaging the non-state actor communities, and also how the interaction between the 2 can be strengthened. And then we look at what is actually included right now in the current indices in terms of NSA pledges and actions and so on, and how can that sort of become more integrated in the next round of indices, as you also mentioned here. And then we're going to touch also on the credibility of what we see out there. I mean, it was quite fascinating for me, who's been working on climate for a long time, to really dive in to look at all the various structures around organization of non-state actors in industries, finance, cities, whatever, and how many actors there really are out there, but also how heterogeneous the whole system is, and then looking at how can you possibly strengthen and harmonize that to provide improved transparency, and also as a tool for enhanced mitigation ambitions. So we had hoped to have Anurupa Ghosh from India in the panel with us, but he had to bail out yesterday because he got another urgent commitment he needed to attend to. He's been part of the UN Secretary General's expert group that was put up 3 or 4 years ago about the net zero commitments by non-state entities, and they presented their report at COP27, including not only transparency guidance, but also a number of other guidance areas, but really have been setting directions for how the discussion about non-state actor transparency since then. So, I mean, not trying to substitute, but I'll put up a slide after this one, just to briefly give the group's recommendations, because they came out exactly what we were trying to finalize the report, and it was very much along the same lines. So we will briefly share those, and then I'll come back to it also in our conclusions at the end of it. As you mentioned, it's been a long transparency process, and I don't think anybody's better to speak to that in terms of Katja, in terms of what the learning and experiences have been. So she will do that after I've been finishing. And then Angel, as you said, will come and talk to how much of this is actually integrated in the current indices they've been analyzing across all the first round of indices, but also the updates for Glasgow and so on, to try and see what's in there, but also looking at how can you then improve integration going forward for the new ones. And as you said, Ruta will then come and talk about, which happens to be a nice coincidence also with the webinar, is that the Secretariat put out last year something called the Recognition and Accountability Framework to enhance engagement within SAs, and there's been a consultative process where the co-chairs just issued their report 1 week ago. So very timely, and also that she will talk to it, that also links with the recommendations, I'd say. Good. So let's move on to the next slide. The summary of what the high-level expert group said on the transparency part of their job. And it spills over to the discussion we're going to have throughout the whole seminar. So basically encouraging non-state actors to disclose their data, and both in terms of actual emissions, but also the plans and roadmaps for how to achieve the net zero. That was the target of it. And in a standardized open format, public platforms that we're moving towards, and we're going to talk more about how that could possibly be done, because it doesn't exist right now. I mean, the Global Climate Action Portal by the Secretariat is sort of the best tool available, will be used going forward, but it will be a huge task, and lots of data gaps and lots of inconsistencies in the way the system is built together for the non-state actor reporting right now. And then, of course, there's the verification part of it. A lot of it is just reported but not followed up on, and we need to have credible data that also need to be verified. And I think one subset of that we'll talk more to is that if that's really going to work, there will be quite a significant effort needed to build capacity, especially in developing countries, small, medium-scale enterprise, so on, in terms of how you actually measure and verify your emissions. And then, of course, in the end, you need to really have accurate and reliable disclosures, because it's part of also for countries. I mean, the whole foundation for the Paris Agreement, in my view, is credible transparency, because that builds trust, and trust is necessary to also build ambition. Good. Then I'll leave the scene to Katja.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who joined the webinar. John noted when we launched the work on our report, we formulated 3 framing questions that need to be addressed. The question on the national transparency experiences and relevant lessons for the non-state actors is directly linked to the first of these framing questions, and it is extensively covered in Chapter 2 of the report. The chapter outlines the evolution of transparency for parties to the Climate Convention that closely mirrors the evolution of international climate change regime and its substantive requirements. The chapter starts with the experiences with transparency under the Convention that was adopted in 1992. It stressed that from the very beginning, transparency has been central for the credibility, accountability, and effectiveness of the climate change regime. It also stressed that transparency requirements are among the few legally binding requirements under the Convention, which is otherwise a framework legislation. Then the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, and its mechanisms required strong links of transparency to the operation of its mechanisms in order to ensure that tone is a tone. That gave a very strong push for further development of methodologies for greenhouse gas emission inventories, and also to methodologies to assess the mitigation impact from projects and programs under the clean development mechanisms and joint implementation. Further, the Cancun MRV, which stands for Measurement, Reporting and Verification System, adopted in 2011, is a major step forward in harmonizing MRV requirement across developed and developing countries. This framework is based on the similar building blocks or elements. However, they have different content for these 2 groups of parties. Therefore, the Cancun framework remained a clear manifestation of the 2-track approach to transparency. The evolution of transparency under the Climate Convention culminated with the adoption of the Paris Agreement and the Enhanced Transparency Framework. The objective of the Enhanced Transparency Framework is to allow tracking of progress and achievement of the national plans, which are known as nationally determined contributions, or as NDCs, which is applicable to all parties. Therefore, The ETF represents a major move forward towards a single track system. Essential links are made between the ETF and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that is on cooperative approaches that are geared to higher ambition. The slide and the diagram that you see in front of you shows clearly the three elements or the building blocks of the ETF. These are reporting, technical expert review, and multilateral facilitative consideration. Requirements for each of these elements apply to all parties, but there is a flexibility accorded to developing countries with regard to some of the legally binding requirements that takes fully into account that many of these countries have limited capacity to engage in such a rigorous system. I wish to stress that Chapter 2 draws links between transparency and ambition. And it clearly shows that transparency is not a substitute for ambition, but rather an enabler for ambition. And this is because of two main reasons. First, because it helps to build confidence that everybody is doing their fair and equitable share in addressing climate change and contributing to the objectives of the Convention. And secondly, because it helps sharing best practices examples that in many cases are replicable or scalable. The chapter outlines the long-term strategies and net zero pledges which John mentioned, which are made by countries, and it also stresses on the challenges to understand and compare them. This is because of the lack of common guidance. This is in contrast to the NDCs, for which we have very clear guidance in terms of the Katowice rulebook, which was adopted in 2018, and that helps to avoid this kind of problems. The chapter concludes with the challenges and opportunities on the way forward in advancing transparency under the Paris Agreement. I wish to mention only one of these challenges. One of the methodological challenges for ETF relates to tracking progress in and achievements of NDCs. The challenge stems from the fact that we have observed diversity among countries' pledges in terms of their form, baseline, base year, etc., and the absence of common and agreed methodologies and indicators for tracking progress. Instead, countries are using a wide variety of methodologies and analytical tools. To some extent, this mirrors the situation with the non-state actors and their rather diverse pledges. Our analysis helped to distill several key lessons from the evolution of transparency as a top-down system under the Convention that have relevance to the requirements for transparency and accountability for the non-state actors. Number one, understanding the role of transparency matters. Transparency is not just about meeting the legal requirements, but an honest account and showcasing efforts and achievements of climate policy and action. Transparency helps countries accelerate their climate action, using opportunities to learn from each other by sharing achievements and best practices. Transparency emerges recently also as a primary element in mobilizing climate finance, where mutual trust and integrity are vital. And it also helps steer international climate finance. Secondly, science matters. This means building transparency system on a sound scientific foundation, such as the IPCC inventory guidelines, which allows to start with rather simple assessment and then motivate actors that are engaged in such assessment to improve over time. Thirdly, capacity and learning matter. This means building capacity for actors that do not otherwise have the capability to engage in transparency system. Here, I wish to mention the capacity building initiative under the GEF, or known as CBIT, that is running now and that helps many developing countries to put in place their enhanced transparency system. This also means starting with data and information that are readily available and then learning from each other experiences from reporting, and in particular through the technical reviews and multilateral exchanges under the UNFCCC. In conclusion, I wish to stress that transparency encourages collective action to address climate change towards a greater ambition that is urgently needed in this critical decade for climate action. Increased transparency shown in the accuracy of data and accessible reports is the key to inform evidence-based decision-making in climate policies at both national and international levels. This was clearly manifested at the first global stocktake that took place at COP28 at the end of the last year. We are witnessing that the accounting and reporting for the non-state actors has evolved as a bottom-up process, in contrast to transparency under the convention that evolved as a top-down process. Yet we showed in the report that many of the lessons from transparency can inform the non-state actors' efforts to further strengthen and harmonize the accounting and reporting. The main difference with the non-state actors is that implementation needs to be much faster given the increasing urgency of climate challenges. Thank you very much. Back to you, Miriam.
Good. Thank you very much, Katja. Then I will be back again and talk a little bit about what I would sort of say the very diverse landscape that we started diving into. And for me, it was an interesting learning experience. So if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, I mean, some quick illustrations. The sort of pie chart on the top side there is just coming from the Secretariat's reports. And I mean, it's from 2022. I checked it up. It's not changed a whole lot. But I mean, what you're talking about is something like 22,000 entities, mainly cities and private companies, but also regions, finance institutions, and a diverse group of other organizations that has basically engaged in some kind of initiative on either net zero or on some other climate commitment and some element of reporting and engagement. So I think that's in itself is very positive. It's a huge number. If we go to the one on the right side where we have where do they then come from? I think then we have, I'd say maybe a typical, but maybe also worrisome that it is mainly Europe and North America. It's not something which has really sort of caught on yet in many developing countries for many good reasons. But of course, it's something that if we need to move forward, we need to ensure that it will be possible for also private sector, cities and whatever in developing countries to engage much stronger in this. And that clearly is a role where the UN can also come and help. If we go down to the lower one, it's basically looking at what does these groups typically entail if you organize in some kind of a joint effort for cities or for a specific sector or something. So a lot of it initially is about mobilizing, that you basically come together, motivate each other to take part in joint action. And I think that's a very strong starting point for almost all the initiatives that we've seen. And then, of course, the next follow-up to that is to come up with some credible plans and goals for how do you then want to achieve the sort of pledge you're making up on the mobilization side. And then later on, when you made the plans, then track and report on them, and in the end, validate and update, as I talked about before. And if you look across the many initiatives, I think it's fair to say that there's very strong engagement on the mobilization. There's usually quite strong engagement on the planning and the acting to some extent, but then it gets more and more thin the closer you get to actually sort of track, report, and validate it. And that is something that needs to be strengthened so you can actually document. It's not just greenwashing, not just something you're saying, but you're actually doing it. If we can have the next one. Yeah, I mean, I have a timeline a little bit similar in structure to the one Katja had, but starting a lot later. It's not that non-state actors didn't do anything before, but I mean, the sort of formalization process really started with the Secretary General's Action Summit in 2014, just before going to Lima and then going to Paris for the Paris Agreement. And also there in Lima, we had the sort of Lima Paris Action Agenda, which was the first sort of structured formalization around non-state actor engagement. And of course, in Paris, there is specific reference to the engagement of non-state actors in the Paris Agreement. And we had a new structure of what was called the high-level champions that we still have as the COP chair, ingoing and outgoing and so on. This then evolved again next year in Morocco into the Marrakesh Partnership, which was basically building on this and creating a new structure to bring things together. And that one has been revisited at the COPs in the coming years. And then at 2021 in Glasgow, there was created a sort of an umbrella structure, which is called the Race to Zero, which many of the other initiatives basically have joined into, and it becomes a kind of umbrella activity. And then we had, because there was this concern by the Secretary General about, is this all credible? Is it delivering at the high-level expert group I mentioned before? On the right side, it's just a sort of scattered reference to a number of different initiatives, not trying to be representative in any form, just to try and indicate how many there are, how many diverse ones, different city ones, different industry ones. And if you go into details, you also have detailed sector subsets. I mean, you have for the wine industry, for cement, for steel, whatever. So there's a large number of groups that bring together the different entities in different settings. Some of them have started coming together. Initially, there were more. It was almost like whenever somebody met, they would create an initiative. But I think that has been sort of streamlined gradually over time, also with Race to Zero, the city's Race to Zero and so on. And also with some of the other alliances that have been created that becomes small umbrellas for the different initiatives originally. So next one. So we take a little bit of a look at what are the sort of approaches to MRV and protocols and so on that are used by these initiatives. The best place to go to try and check that out is to what is called CDP, because they are the main registry and they have about 20,000 non-state actors reporting to them in some format. If you go into the CDP, they reference the use of at least 70 different reporting protocols by the various initiatives. And that is a bit scary, I think. But if you then dig into these 70 different protocols, you have to realize that almost all of them build on one of these three sort of global protocol initiatives: the Global Reporting Initiative, the ISO standard, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol by WI and other partners. So they're basically sort of the foundation. Then they branch out into more detailed sectoral ones and so on. But still, I mean, this initiative that was launched also, I think it was in Glasgow, on trying to bring together some of the actors about this Our World initiative. They did a sort of study of what's the view of access. And basically, they say, I mean, they face a big confusing set of choices. Huge number of standards are available with limited centralized guidance. So it's really difficult also to operate in. But this is clearly something where there is a need to guide new entries and also to guide the ones that are existing in there, maybe try to bring them together. If you look at, when we started digging a little bit further in, you can see a sort of movement towards more integration, especially in the city area where you had originally had a number of different platforms. They have now come much more together with the Global Covenant of Mayors, CDP, ICLE, and C40, but also come with a common protocol for community-scale greenhouse gas inventories. We see something similar happening in the finance industry, where again partners come together into some kind of joint effort where they have the sort of carbon accounting financials to develop a greenhouse gas reporting standard and so on. So there is convergence, and UNEP's finance initiative is one of the drivers behind that. I think we discussed a little bit the drivers, what's driving this kind of convergence. I think for the cities, it's really that in the beginning, many of them were part of different initiatives and had difficulty seeing the rationale in being part of 2 or 3 different ones, and then encourage them to try and come together to be more harmonized. I think for the finance industry, a part of the drive is also that there is upcoming legislation on CSR disclosures, both in the US, in Europe, and in the UK, which is driving them into having this as a formal requirement, and therefore they need to come together. So I think, is there one more? I can't remember. Yes, no, I mean, the last thing we looked at was the credibility of what they're actually being pledged. It's really difficult to try and look at, but if you look at two things, one is the little box. I mean, CDP annually has a kind of survey where they go out and ask all their clients about a number of different topics, where they have 24 indicators they reference. And I think the one last year, they said there's only about less than 1% of all the companies that report that actually meet the 24 indicators that CDP thinks is vital to have a credible climate plan. So there's a long way to go. Then we looked at a study about the New Climate Institute, basically saying, okay, so what is it that it looked at 25 really big companies and look at what are they pledging and what are they actually doing and what is left out. So typically they make a pledge to come to net zero for their whole business, but in reality, what they deal with is scope 1, scope 2, maybe a little bit more, and then the whole scope 3 area is typically left out, and then there's some unclarity about the remaining part where they actually go all the way. So basically indicating that a lot of it is pledged without really clear plans and roadmaps for how to achieve it, and that is, of course, also distressing, and that's something that needs to be part of a more credible transparency system overall to make sure that what they say is actually what they do. And I'm going to leave that and then go over to Angel to see what's actually part of the NDCs right now.
Thank you so much, John. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about how the current NDCs reflect the contributions of non-state actors. When we originally did this analysis in around 2019, looking at the original NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that parties pledged to the Paris Agreement, we actually found that there weren't that many countries in the developed world that actually mentioned non-state actors, that made references to private institutions or the roles and contributions of subnational governments. In fact, only 147 countries mentioned non-state actors. 45, including the EU, actually didn't mention non-state actors at all in the NDCs. So that was quite surprising. Fast forward to, as John mentioned, the parties were asked to then submit revised NDCs in the lead up to the Glasgow Climate Summit in 2021. And so that's what this map here is showing an update of the NDCs and how many countries actually reference non-state actors in that text. We also looked at the long-term strategies. So these are longer-term communications that parties have put forward to articulate visions and targets to 2040, 2050, and beyond. And so you can see here that there's a lot more coverage. In fact, in green, we have all non-state actor groups that we considered, including local government and non-government organizations and companies also mentioned. So when non-state actors were mentioned in either the NDCs or the long-term strategies, 85% of them, they actually referred to all three groups. And so we definitely see the uptake and growing awareness on the part of parties to include mentions of non-state actors within the text. So I think that's a positive shift that we saw in a short amount of time from 2014 with the intended nationally determined contributions up until the first revision, enhancing ambition in 2021. Can we go to the next slide? But this is showing some of the analysis from the report where even when we started to get into the details of exactly how parties and national governments are referring to non-state actors, we see that developing countries are still mentioning non-state actors quite a bit, frequently mentioning all three non-state actor groups. Even when they were mentioning non-state actors, I pulled out a couple of examples from long-term strategies and the NDCs. You can see that the statements are quite broad. And so the United States is just mentioning non-governmental organizations are acting ambitiously to address climate change, but there's not specifics in terms of how exactly they're doing that or what they're actually contributing. And there's mention of universities and cultural institutions, investors and businesses, and it just says that they're going to be required to implement their efforts in order to achieve the US's 2050 goal. And same thing with China, is talking about support is being given to peaking pioneers from locality sectors and companies. And similarly with Costa Rica, there's just these mentions of non-state actors, but not a whole lot of specifics in terms of what exactly they are going to be contributing. So can we go to the next slide, please? But even looking at these broad statements and the passages of text within the NDCs and LTSs where non-state actors were mentioned, we could still extract some themes. And so that's what's being plotted here. On the left, we have the bars shaded according to whether or not the NDCs were coming from developed or developing countries, or the text more broadly were coming from developed or developing countries. And in B, looking at a comparison of these themes or these topic breakdowns by LTS or NDC. So you can see that by far the tallest bar here is just general statements about non-state actors, institutions. So in fact, this particular theme accounted for about 30% of the overall discourse. So still quite broad, just talking about how the non-state actors could provide more institutional support to the national governments to actually implement their NDCs. But then following closely, and this is similar to our previous analysis of the original NDCs, the theme of adaptation was also quite common. And we saw that there were a lot of mentions of adaptation along with the importance of integrating gender and women's perspectives into climate strategies. And this was a theme that was quite dominant looking at developing country NDCs. But then we also see, I'm not sure what the next, can we go to the next slide? Is there like a highlight on low carbon? Yes, highlighting low carbon transition. I thought this was also quite interesting, where from developed country NDCs and LTSs, we could see that there was emphasis on non-state actors helping national governments actually implement and achieve low carbon transition and collaborations between businesses and government. And there was a particular focus on investments in green technologies and also science-based approaches. On one example from the developing countryside, Panama emphasized an approach to circular economy across all national sectors. And then Slovenia also talked about non-state actors being able to support green technology developments, and they highlighted strategic partnerships with the private sector that are pivotal for achieving broader climate goals. And so we did see some differences between how developed and developing countries were referring to non-state actors and the themes and the areas in which they could see non-state actors helping to implement or partnering strategically in certain areas. Can we go to the next slide? And then I wanted to just leave on, and I believe that next speaker will also talk more in detail. Ruta will talk about the non-state actor recognition and accountability framework, but this is the recommendations for how to bolster the linkages between non-state actors and NDCs, because we can see that even though there is progress, more awareness, more governments actually referring to non-state actors within their NDCs, it's still quite broad and the themes are pretty limited. And so there could be a lot more opportunity to better link what non-state actors are actually doing. Katja talked about the reporting that non-state actors have been doing. It's been largely bottom up. As John mentioned, the reporting requirements are quite different in the various initiatives that non-state actors primarily participate within. And so there's a lot of diversity. And so one opportunity is actually through regulatory frameworks of non-state actors that have been emerging in quite a number of countries throughout the world. So I have here on this slide a map from Oxford Net Zero's Race to Regulation report, where they're talking about greater regulation of non-state actors, particularly their net zero commitments. And so you can see more and more countries, including in the United States, where I'm based, the Securities and Economic Commission, they've been also working to better regulate disclosures from companies. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to try to close this conveyor belt between non-state actors and then also national actors. And one of the ways where non-state actors can improve these linkages in reporting is actually through digital reporting. So we have a chapter in the report specifically talking about the opportunity for digital technologies to help streamline these reporting processes on the part of NSAs to make it more efficient and hopefully more transparent and easier for national governments to be able to understand what non-state actors are doing and then incorporate those into NDCs. So I'm not going to go into too many details on that piece, but I would encourage you to read the report. And then, of course, John mentioned that there's an opportunity, and this is what the high-level expert group on net zero also recommended, and it's also the RAF recommended this as well, which is revamping of the Global Climate Action Portal, GCAP, which is managed by the UNFCCC Secretariat. And so in my latest conversations with the Secretariat, I've heard that there's a process now that GCAP is undergoing to revamp it to allow for individual non-state actors and initiatives to have their own pages to incorporate reported data directly. And so that could also have a huge potential to bolster transparency of non-state actor efforts and to also improve the linkages with national governments. And hopefully that can bridge some of these information gaps that we noted in the report are very common when it comes to non-state actors because of the diversity and the different levels of transparency that non-state actors are bringing to the space of climate governance. But of course, they need to have more technical capacity being built. So we talk about that in the report, that non-state actors also have cited, and I wrote a report about this last November where I surveyed many of the different constituents in non-state actors, and they repeatedly came back to not having enough technical capacity or resources to actually do the reporting on a regular and consistent basis. And so that's also where the digital technology piece can come in as well to help facilitate and make it easier for non-state actors to be transparent and report on their actions. So thank you. I'll pass to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, John and Miriam. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues around the globe. I will follow up on what Angel, the previous speaker, was talking about and what John was mentioning, and I would remind you about the consultation process that led to the recognition and accountability framework recommendations. So if we look at the next slide, we will see the 6 recommendations which have been issued last week after the process of 1 year, consultative process of 1 year. Those recommendations were already flagged by John and Angel, but let me remind you about the pathway, how we reached those recommendations, and then shortly I will go through them. So you remember that John was mentioning that in November 2022, United Nations Secretary General issued the report Integrity Matters, and recommendation 8 of that report called for more accountability and transparency. In response to that recommendation, the UN Climate Change issued recognition and accountability framework and draft implementation plan in June 2023 and launched the consultations. The consultations that the results you see on the screen started in September and went through December, and they were led by co-chairs. Dr. Bing Glenn, a member of International Sustainability Standard Board-based Invasion, and Professor Sarah Bloom-Raskin, former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury and currently Distinguished Professor of Law at Duke University. The co-chairs organized a number of consultation channels. There was a public survey. There was a written submission by all the actors, and 500 submissions have been received. There were online roundtables organized and consultations with the parties at COP29, as well as a high-level event at COP29. Having collected those inputs from consultations, then a summary of those inputs and synthesis has been made and has been prepared by an advisory group. Advisory group was composed of 16 members, including the CEOs, leaders of finance and business organizations, as well as NGOs, civil society, and cities. So in the end, last week, those 6 recommendations have been crystallized, as well as the challenges has been crystallized and planned. Among the challenges that the co-chairs state in their letter is around credibility, and that goes back to John's, to one of the figures that John has showed us previously. And there also challenges speak around the diversity of the voluntary net zero initiatives and difficulty to compare. It also speaks about the difficulty to align policy incentives with investments. It speaks about difficulty or lack of data, and also about insufficient linkages between NDCs and commitments of non-state entities. Exactly the same fact that Angel has flagged earlier. We also, with COSHI, has also flagged the challenge of the technical capacity and the underutilized potential of the UN Global Climate Action Portal GCAP. So to respond to those challenges, those 6 recommendations have been flagged, and you see that that includes quite a big array of work, including number 4, where we speak about the transparency pipeline and bridges, bridging information gaps between NDCs and between non-party stakeholder commitments. Here we also have the request that UNEP Gap Report include assessment of those gaps in every annual UN Gap Report, and here I should be very happy to be for this collaboration among UNFCCC and UNEP, continuous traditional collaboration on preparing UNEP Gap Report, as well as the recommendation 6, where we speak about the GCAP and revamping of GCAP. And you rightly note that this revamping work is ongoing, and quite soon everybody would be able to see a quite enhanced GCAP portal. So as the next steps, there is a big challenge in front of us to actually transform those recommendations and those challenges into the tangible implementation plan, and of course noting the scope of work that is on the table, that will have implications, financial and staffing implications for UN climate change. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Miriam.
Thanks, Ruta. There was a little bit of problem with your sound now and then, but I hope people caught what you're saying. And if we can just have the final slide, then we can talk a little bit from that. I mean, as Angel mentioned, I mean, there are lots of things in the report that we can't cover in this short webinar. And I think if you're interested in some answers to some of these questions, go have a look at the report, because there's, as you said, a specific chapter by another colleague called Marco, who couldn't be on today, about possible technological solutions that could help bridge some of this. Because if you look at the 6 recommendations that Ruta just presented from this informal advisory system around the document of the recognition, accountability, and so on, it's really huge tasks. And it will require quite a lot of resources from the Secretariat to actually do what they're being recommended to do. So it'll be interesting to see if the non-state actor community is also willing to follow up and, you could say, engage in funding some of this work. Because if you look at all these different initiatives right now, they all have their own secretariats and they all have their own experts that help out and so on. And some of that needs to be activated or integrated into this overall process for it to come together at all, because it is a humongous effort that's required because of the number of actors we talk about. So when we wrote the report, I mean, when we had done the recommendations, it was almost at the time where the high-level expert group came out. So we were, of course, very positive about how aligned we were, and we were also inspired by them in the end. And I think when you now look at this new recommendations from the independent co-chairs, it's very much along the same lines again. So I don't want to go in a lot of detail, but maybe adding a couple of things is, I mean, if you look at the first recommendation, is really to try to build the understanding in the non-state actor community about the value of this, not just the pledge value, but also the value of actually having documented, verified reports on the action that happened. So you can actually say, this is not only what I said, this is what we've done, and these are the results. And it's exactly the same discussion which is going on now with the countries who are supposed to submit their first biannual transparency reports here by the end of the year. And then it's really the foundation for them talking about what is the ambition for the next round. Because if nobody can prove that they've actually done what they've said, why would anybody else go and do more? I mean, it doesn't make sense. So it really is the foundation. And then I think, as I mentioned already before, and we've heard several times, I mean, we also need to move into a better structure to advise countries on how to integrate non-state actor actions in the official indices and in the official activities. And in another program called ICAP, the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, we've actually done guidance on how to do that, and there's been some case examples done by, I think it's WI did it for them. And so there is an increasing sort of documentation about the possibilities for doing so. And it's not an easy one, but you really need to engage the communities, and many countries do it when they sort of do stakeholder engagement in the NDC development, but it's not enough to discuss it before. You really need to integrate the action, because many of the actions that countries commit to will actually be implemented by the private sector, for instance. Then, as we heard now, I mean, you need to have some central clearinghouse and using probably some more fancy digital tools to make it this possible at all, and also to make it sort of interoperable between the different data sets that are available. And there is efforts going on that. There are also efforts going on having more digital greenhouse gas emission data. And of course, we need to see how you align that with the IPCC bottom-up inventories and so on. But it is an area which is moving really, really quickly, because the artificial intelligence and the other things happening on the IT side gives a number of new opportunities. And then, as Ruta just said, I mean, it's something where the Secretariat for sure will be playing an active facilitation role in creating these dialogues, and UNEP is happy to help. And of course, then the last thing, which I think is really essential, is that you need to support them, especially developing countries, non-state actors, in improving data collection and reporting, and by all means also with the digital technologies, but also simply broad-based capacity building in terms of understanding and how to do this. So that's the sort of final message from us. And then we still have a little bit of time left for question and answer, and I hope that we will have some. And I would invite the other panelists to basically turn on their cameras and speakers and come online.
Thank you very much, John, to everyone. This has been a very rich hour of you all providing different insights and knowledge coming out from this report. As I said at the beginning, this is timely as countries are, preparing their first biennial transparency report, and also the relevance now of making these connections with non-state actor climate actions. So we could argue that at some point this differentiation is sort of artificial, but as John also said, that government will rely on private sector and non-state actors' contributions nationally. So I know that the connections might be there, but they are not very apparent. And something you, Katia, for example, mentioned about the transparency being an enabler of ambition, and at the same time, regulation being the element that most countries are struggling with. I wanted to hear a little bit more about your reflections around the importance of regulation, because, as you say, in different areas of climate change, if regulation is not in place, even for digital solutions, for example, the solutions we offer and we provide will take longer to materialize. So I wanted to briefly ask you to reflect on the importance of regulation to give, let's say, in a way, some sort of life to transparency as enabler for ambition. As you know, this connects also to the fact that countries have to work on their NDCs in a way being in line with the 1.5 degrees temperature goal. So I don't know who would like to kick off with that as we wait for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think, Miriam, you really hit the nail on the head. I think the regulation is absolutely critical. I mean, because we've been in this voluntary space for the last several decades with respect to non-state actors. And frankly, the data picture hasn't really changed that markedly. Like, I just think about my first job almost 20 years ago working at the World Resources Institute, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative, where I was training companies and governments to use the protocol to develop their emissions inventories. And there's been very little innovation in how we expect both private actors and also subnational governments or other entities to measure their emissions. And frankly, the picture hasn't changed. We still know, and we still have a lot of data coming from Europe and North America and from the global north, and we still have these massive blind spots in the global south. And so I think that's really, it's high time that we have national governments actually take on trying to actually regulate disclosures and to mandate companies and other entities to report their emissions. So you saw that map. I mean, it's updating almost on a daily basis. And so I think when you have a government like the US tell every single company or major company, you have to report your scope 1, your direct emissions, that's going to go a really long way to be able to develop this more complete picture of who's doing what progress is being made on climate action, and how the national governments can then take that information to and have the confidence to then enhance their NDC. So this is the conveyor belt of ambition, but also moving from this voluntary to the regulatory space to try to connect these dots. So I think it's absolutely critical.
Thank you very much, Angel. Very relevant. Somebody else would like to reflect on that?
If nobody, I mean, I agree with what Angel said, but I think it links with some of the recommendations that I just presented also, because first of all, you need to have the enforcement ability. And you can see even in the US, where you have the enforcement ability, I mean, even the regulation has been debated. Lots of states are going to challenge it legally and so on. So I mean, it's really uphill. EU is a little easier because it's politically very different. So it's coming out there, but it's still something where there's a lot of resistance in the companies to being pushed in. But there you actually have the enforcement capability, which many of the developing countries is missing. But I think also, I mean, for this to work, and if I come back to Katja's presentation, and one of the reasons it's taken so long, in a sense, is also you need to basically have the awareness, the understanding of what does transparency really mean, also at the country level. And before you have motivation in the private sector, in cities, and so many of them are motivated, but many simply don't. You need to work on that at the same time, and then I think you have to have the tools that are relevant for them to do it. And then, of course, you need, as I've said several times, we need support to then actually make it happen, the same way as all the developing countries right now are getting quite a significant amount of support for delivering their reports. So, I mean, if you do that with the private sector, you need to have some kind of engagement process where you can, maybe through business associations, city associations, you can't address every single company. That's got to be impossible. But you can work collectively on it, hopefully. But completely agree. I mean, we need to move in that direction for sure. But it is a big task.
Indeed, it's a big task, as also governments right now have big tasks because they have to implement around 180 provisions of the enhanced transparency framework. And as the report states, there has been a lot of learning from that process of around 30 years of continuing the report. And I'm sure that this will inform. So from the state side, we have the enhanced transparency framework, and from the emerging non-state actor, we have this recognition and accountability framework that is also guiding somehow that non-state actors are going to be somehow accountable for their pledges as well. So I think we are in the right track. Everything in climate change is slow. It takes time to materialize, but and here in the UNEP CCC and in UNEP, and together with all of you experts in the area, we are constantly looking at emerging issues and developing this knowledge material with objective of contributing these discussions and furthering or developing, let's say, the knowledge towards these new emerging issues. And we talk about climate change and all these processes presenting challenges to us, but I think we can also say that those challenges are bringing opportunities to continuously improve the processes at the state level and the non-state level. So at some point, there will be discussions where these apparent parallel works will come together. And for that, we already hear the IPCC is working with Secretariat, for example, in making connections of the methodologies, in the interoperability between the IPCC software that countries use and also the transparency tools that Secretariat is preparing. So there are opportunities, and I think we will continue working around this area with this fantastic group of experts. Stay tuned for upcoming knowledge material, but also upcoming webinars. As I said, UNEP and UNEP CCC contribute with this kind of exchanges in a way to bring experiences and opportunities for our audience to have more learning around this. So stay tuned. We didn't see questions from the audience, but I know that it's still a hard topic. We invite everyone to read the report. It's a very interesting one. And send comments or inputs if you wish to the speakers here or to the center itself. So I don't know if anyone would like to have some final words from our speakers. We still have some minutes.
Yeah, I think we'll
knowledge material on the way that we should be promoting.
Thank all of you for coming along and having a nice talk about it. And I'm sure some of us will meet maybe in Bonn, and I'm sure the discussion here will continue, especially with the RAF recommendations in terms of how to follow up with that, because it is a really steep challenge. But it needs to be done. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Yes, also from my side, a big thanks to everybody, and very nice meeting you. Angel, I think I've heard your name very much, and Eukatia, and my good friend Ruta, of course, and my boss, John. Thank you to everyone.
They're all emission gap report engagements. I mean, we all come from the same family. And with this recommendation also from RAF, I'm sure we'll be bringing you back in, Angel, when we get to that, because there's a very strong recommendation there too, in terms of picking it up. And we already talked about maybe doing something next year. So I'm sure we'll be back.
Yes, we will. And as John always says, good work brings more work. So on those words, thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.